Well, good evening, everyone. It's a genuine delight, even as an Oxford man, to be here in Cambridge for this wonderful TEDx event. And thank you, Melton, for organising it, and thank you for asking me to be the introductory speaker. So if we go on to my first slide, here's me, this exotic creature, but please call me Al. And here's my title: Why must we put compassion back into compassionate care to transform health and care services? And I'm also delighted to wear my new hat as the first and so far only Professor of Compassionate Care in the University of Northampton. So what is the purpose of my talk today? What is the purpose of my new professorship? It is to expose and address the mismatch that I see between the wonders of medical science today and the erosion of the humanity of care in our services. So my professorship is dedicated to understanding the humanity of our services today. Why? Well, I'm standing before you as a man deep in the valley of tears. It's 2 years since my adored wife of 57 years died, and I'm now a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. And this has driven me into my new purpose of life, which is to put compassion back into compassionate care. So my speech tonight, my new chair, everything about me, is dedicated to the memory of my adored wife of 57 years, Rosemary, who died just over 2 years ago, where we experienced the first-hand knowledge of the swamps of dementia care. Look, there are appalling medical problems we all encounter, but of them I would argue that dementia is one of the most terrible of illnesses to inflict on anyone. And my wife suffered this. She experienced a 3-year descent into the cruelty of vascular dementia, ending up not knowing who she was, not recognizing me, no memory of our wonderful life together. As she started to go down this route, she developed the signs of kidney cancer. And I was told she had to come into hospital, but I would not be allowed to be with her. I had to leave her at the door to the hospital, despite the fact she was entirely dependent on me. I was her registered carer. I'm sorry I lost it. I proved that we were COVID negative. I proved we had self-isolated for 2 weeks, and I insisted on being with her as a carer, not as a visitor. And eventually, my objections prevailed. I was allowed in beside her, where I could prove by being a carer and not a visitor, I could contribute to the team looking after her. For example, I could walk with her to the operating room. I was there when she came to afterwards. I could encourage her to drink. And in fact, we got home 3 days earlier than expected because I was a carer working with the team and not just as a visitor. Hardly surprising, and I was unaware of this at the time, people with dementia who undergo surgery can very rapidly deteriorate afterwards. And that was the case with Rosemary. I was compelled to admit her to a memory care home despite my marriage vows. I had to admit her. I could no longer cope at home with her behavior, her wandering, her incontinence, etc. We had to find a caring, compassionate care home, which we did, and she was there for 9 months. I went in every day to spoon feed her because she would not accept food from anyone else except me, even though she didn't really know who I was. And then she fell, fracturing her hip. And I had my second major confrontation with my profession when I was told in no uncertain terms she must be admitted immediately to hospital for her hip to be pinned under surgery. I refused. I saw this to be unspeakable cruelty. And those are the words I used: unspeakable cruelty, to inflict the pain of surgery on my wife, who couldn't possibly understand it. To have a difficult operation, then rehabilitation, if at all, back to a life of severe dementia. And I refused. I was told I was the only person ever to refuse the pinning of an old person's hip. I demanded palliative care. Unfortunately, a compassionate, and that's the word, a compassionate general practitioner agreed with me he called in the wonderful community nurses who set up a diamorphine drip into her arm, and she died in peace, in love, in my arms 3 days later. And as she was dying, the care home staff was simply wonderful. They allowed me to be there, to lie beside her, to hold her tight, to tell her I loved her. And they were there. They held my hand as she came towards the end, and they wept with me when she took her final breaths, and then they came to the funeral. Look, that is compassion, way beyond the call of duty, compared to my profession, with the attitude, we can do, so we will do. The attitude of surgeons, that we can do, so we will do. And I objected strongly to that. And I leave it to you to think about this. Is the can-do, will-do attitude present here in Cambridge, I ask you? So I had confrontation over the advice to admit her, and she died in my arms, as I said. So that triggered me, with our experience, as to look critically, academically, at the journeys we were through with a new purpose in life. My psychotherapist said to me, Al, you need a new purpose in life. So my purpose in life now is to put compassion back into compassionate care. And it's not just the care of the elderly. This is a story just given to me last month by an 18-year-old student from a prestigious university who developed a rare and complicated illness. She spent 6 weeks in a local hospital and then 4 weeks in a regional referral centre. Neither hospital had any knowledge or expertise or facilities for adolescents, let alone young people in transition to adult services. She was nursed initially in a cramped overflow surgical bay, a 5-bedded bay with 4 other patients, all of them over the age of 80 and all of them suffering from dementia. What do you think it was like to be an 18-year-old pretty girl in this environment? And then in the regional referral centre, they did their best to investigate her. They were tight of space, but they admitted her only to put her into a men's ward, into a side room where she was exposed to male patients with prostate problems, etc. Then she was put in an ensuite, which was much better, but she saw appalling bedside manners by some consultants and by the junior staff who were aping the behaviours of their seniors. Repeated physical examinations, often with no request for permission or explanation why she wanted to be examined. Failure to explain tests. Her mother was compelled to demand that she slept by her bed because she wanted to protect her in this environment. So extremes of behaviors and nursing staff, discharged with a chaotic follow-up plan and a failure of communication. This experience may not be uncommon, and young women particularly between the ages of 18 to 25. So what do you think about this? Am I right to demand some research into the lived experiences of young people in transition, especially young women? So here's my own experience. 9 months ago, I was in a conference in Lisbon in Portugal to talk about compassion. And as usual, with an old man in the middle of the night, I needed to go for a pee. And so in a strange bedroom, I didn't put on the light properly. I got to the bathroom where I promptly slipped and fell and fractured my hip. Now there's me in Portugal. What would you have done with a fractured hip? Would you have stayed in Portugal or tried to get back to England? I chose to come back to England. It was a family conference with many of my friends and colleagues there, and a former ward sister of mine at Great Ormond Street said, Al, if you're going back to England, I'm coming with you. And so she dropped everything, showing extraordinary compassion for me, and we flew back to England with a fractured hip, diagnosed, pinned and plated, very, very quickly. And then I spent a week on the acute orthopedic ward. And my goodness, if you want to see the pressures on the NHS, go to an acute orthopedic ward, where I was there for a week. After 4 days, I said to the staff, they said, excuse me, is there a sister on this ward? I haven't seen her. They said, oh yes, but she's in the office doing her paperwork. So what does this mean? Are we existing in a nursing culture of administrative overload? I think we are. And there's a lot in the literature about this. I've just come back from a month's lecture tour of Australia. And in Flinders University, for example, there's great concern about what are we training nurses to be and to do when they come out of nursing. And here are two references which address the issue of missed nursing care. And so we have many wonderful caring staff, and let's celebrate that. I'm not denying we do have fantastic staff, but nursing is often done badly or even missed with a range of adverse outcomes as described in these two papers. So is lack of compassion a contributing factor to what we are seeing in the culture of nursing? So what is compassion? In my simple mind, it means putting yourself in the shoes of others and doing something about it. It's an active word in contrast to empathy, which is just putting yourself in the shoes of others. So compassion to me means putting yourself in the shoes of others and doing something about it. It's an active word. So I talk about the humanity of care, and that's my purpose in my new chair. What do the words actually mean? There are 5 different words, although people think they're often synonyms, but they're not. Empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of others. Compassion, and doing something about it. Sympathy, feelings of pity at someone else's misfortune. Love, deep affection, kindness, being helpful and caring about others. All those 5 words are very, very important in what I describe as the humanity of care. So they're not synonyms. So I asked the question here tonight in Cambridge, are your services here and the culture in your services compassionate? Here we have the wonders of science in this city, this university, this medical school, this hospital. A temple of high-quality science. Is it matched in this city by equivalent high standards of compassion and care in the patients we are looking after? How do you know? Does anybody ask the question? And if you don't know, well, perhaps you should know whether compassion actually is embedded in your culture here. And I suggest that compassion is more than one thing. It's theory and science, it's compassionate leadership, it's organizational compassion, institutional compassion, teaching and training. Where is it mentioned? In the training of doctors and nurses. Self-compassion, of course, then compassion and practice. So what do they mean for you? And there's a whole host of obstacles to this. The first is the COVID effect. Look, there's no doubt that COVID has had a devastating effect on the cultures in our services, and we're still seeing the ripples from that. Little time to spend on compassion. I challenge that head on. If it matters, you find time to sit beside someone and talk with them, to hold their hand, to give them a hanky. Then territorialism. Oh, I'm a hospital nurse, you're a GP nurse. Tribalism, I'm a psychologist, you're a psychiatrist. Traditionalism, we've always done it this way. Treasury, we haven't got the money. And terror, what if we get it wrong? I've got 60 patients waiting for me in my outpatients. I haven't got time for this, Al. So how can we make progress? I offer you Congenital Hyperinsulinism International. This is a wonderful organization for a rare disease I specialized in at Great Ormond Street 30 years ago. 600 participants we've sat down with and asked them to describe their journeys through the illness of their baby. Individuals were remembered for compassion, but not one family said it was embedded as a fundamental operating principle in the hospitals they were nursed in. Harrowing accounts, a lack of understanding of family grief, and then accessing services outside of hospital. So we asked them, what was it like when you were given the news of this devastating illness? And these were the questions we asked, and the responses were simply appalling. The bad news being given in a ward with a curtain, no privacy, or in a corridor, on a telephone, often by a doctor standing over them, not really having any sympathy or let alone compassion for the fact these families were suffering grief. They expected a bonny bouncing baby, and someone said, sorry guys, you've got a baby with a serious problem. So what would have made it easier? Being prepared to listen. And then finally, I work with Exitor University, which trains radiographers, people who take the x-rays. And they told me that 95% of all patients pass through the X-ray department, so they have eyes and ears. They see what's going on. And they were very concerned about unnecessary tests, especially towards the end of life, and how poorly patients were prepared for these examinations. So they were determined in their specialty in Exeter to make radiography person-centered. And they have published on this, I can give you the reference, as a discipline to make it compassionate. That's an example to all of us. So finally, as I move towards the end, I offer you this photograph of me in Budapest with the memorial to the shoes. I'm not sure if any of you have been there. These are shoes made of steel and embedded in the parapet to the Danube. And they represent the shoes that people were told to take off by the Nazis in 1944, when these people were herded to the banks of the Danube, tied together in threes, and then shot to fall into the Danube. That's what happens when compassion is lost completely. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near that today. It's a slippery slope unless we grasp it. And so I offer you, as one of my last slides, recommendations for the way forward. I'm looking for a cultural transformation. That's the key word for tonight in health and care services. I'm looking for a momentum for compassion. A key operating principle led by the chief nurses officers, every organization to promote its importance, the views of patients and families to be sought regularly, and much better and earlier focus on compassion and undergraduates and postgraduates. I've been to Melbourne just last month, where I saw medical students who off their own bat had developed a course on death and dying. And they were employing actors for the medical students to interview them and as people who were dying and the carers of people who were dying. And these kids were videoed, and the videos were played back to them so they could see their communication skills. Communication as an essential component of compassion. And so we need to encourage staff at all levels to expose poor practices alongside celebrating absolutely excellent care. And I'm calling for a compassion coordinator in every setting. I road tested that in Perth in Western Australia last month. I had a compassion coordinator who worked across the hospital, bringing people together to the standing room only speeches I gave in the hospital, emphasizing the importance of compassion. So in Wrapup, where do we go from here? I've spelled out to you the sheer horror of being a carer of someone with severe dementia. I've told you of my confrontation with my profession over the we can do so we will do attitude. I've told you about the experiences of a young person in a mismatched older person's ward. I've told you about the arrogance of some consultants, not everyone, but some consultants. And I've told you my recommendations, including a momentum for compassion. So here's my ultimate challenge. What are you going to do about this? If you think there is something positive, something reasonable in what I'm saying, then what are you going to do? It's got to be a momentum when it starts with us and it begins with actually listening to what people have to say about their experiences. And thank you for your attention.